Thanks, Beth. Welcome, everybody. I am delighted to have you join me to have a conversation about trauma-informed care and motivational interviewing for PATH. So this one won't be quite as PATH intensive as the last one was, but one of my favorite things to talk about is trauma-informed care, and motivational interviewing is absolutely a perfect tool for helping people who have backgrounds of trauma. And as you know, and as I know, that includes most, if not all, of the people who we work with on a daily basis, people who are experiencing homelessness, who have serious mental illness or serious mental illness and co-occurring disorders. So this is a discussion that's important for PATH. By the end of these sessions, I hope you will be able to describe why it's important to understand trauma in your work with PATH. And I want you to be able to name at least 3 motivational interviewing tools that are effective for working for folks with backgrounds of trauma. I love this quote, and I'm sharing it because it really encapsulates what we're trying to convey today. And that is, there are wounds that never show on the body that are deeper and more hurtful than anything that bleeds. And I honestly believe that's the truth. When we see people standing on street corners, when we see people hanging around outside shelters or with signs asking for help, a lot of times we'll hear from strangers passing by, or we'll hear from even people we know, why don't they just get a job? Why don't they just, move on with their lives? And the reality is we cannot ever see what's broken, particularly when people have been broken by trauma. So we're going to talk a lot more about that as we go forward. What I would love you to do is just, who are you and where are you from? But what is one thing that's really important to remember when you are working with survivors of homelessness and trauma? We'll have time for questions and discussion at the end of this presentation, but I want to make sure that you are aware that I know that you are absolutely the experts in this. You're working with this every day. So what have you learned through your work about working with the survivors of homelessness and trauma? So if you were to add that to the chat, I'll keep an eye out, and then we will, I will read a few of them once they pop up. So we are really going to be talking about understanding trauma. And I just love this picture, but I think what it evokes for me is that no matter how perfect the picture is, there are going to be things that transcend our view and our small realm, if you will. And I like the birds for that reason. So what is trauma? Trauma is a normal response to an abnormal situation. Trauma is a normal response to an abnormal situation. And I have a couple of kid pictures here. One of the things that this reminds me of is a story that my best friend told me one time. And she was a grade school teacher in a very small rural town. And she came home, or she came, to me one day. She came to my home and she said, "Oh my gosh, I had the most horrifying experience today in my classroom." And I said, "Well, what happened?" And she said, "Well, I had the children, handed out coloring paper and crayons, and I asked them to write or to draw a picture of spring. What does spring mean to you?" And she said there was a dad or a man, clearly a man, holding what I asked about. "What is this?" Joey, and Joey said, "Oh, that's the rototiller." And she said, "Well, what are all these little red things in the air?" And he said, "Well, Dad didn't bury Brewster the dog deep enough, I guess, when he killed him. And those are bits of Brewster." Now that was horrifying. This kid had normalized it in this picture, and he didn't appear to be terribly upset. But, going forward, I would think seeing Dad kill Brewster and then seeing bits of Brewster coming up in the wake of the rototiller probably would be the stuff of nightmares. So this child did what he was asked. What does spring mean to you? And to that little child, it was bits of Brewster. Trauma defined, this is actually SAMHSA's definition of trauma. Individual trauma results from an event or a series of events or a set of circumstances experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on their functioning. That's mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. I think typically it's a combination of those. What I want to underline here, the most important part to me of this definition is that as is experienced by an individual. So one person may experience something as traumatic. Another may just be able to retain the view that they have control. They're not at immediate risk of, their life isn't at risk. Another life isn't at risk. This can be dealt with as we move forward. So I think that it comes down to how the individual perceives what's happening. And we'll talk way more about that as we go forward. I didn't realize this had effects on it, so I apologize for that. So what we know are potentially traumatic events are abuse. So that's emotional, physical, or sexual abuse. It can also be domestic violence in the home, witnessing violence. It can be bullying. It can be any of the things that we can easily recognize as abuse. Cyberbullying is a newer one. Institutional bullying, and I think that's an important one to bring up because this oftentimes abuse is systemic, and we're learning more and more about that as we move forward. It can be loss. It can be the death of someone that we care about. It can be abandonment. Neglect is a form of loss. Separation. So dad goes to prison, mom goes to prison. Mom gets sole custody and you don't get to see your dad. It can be a whole bunch of it can take a lot of forms. But these things are experienced as really impactful in a child's life. It can be natural disaster. It can be an accident or terrorism or war. And then chronic stressors are also potentially traumatic, and that can be poverty. What we know is that a lot of the folks we serve are coming from backgrounds of significant, often intergenerational poverty, and poverty limits choices. And it is something that you think about, pretty much every moment of every day. Am I going to have enough money to buy gas to get to work? Now Johnny is supposed to go to the library. I don't have enough gas to get to the library and go to work. But if I don't get Johnny to the library, it fails this important assignment. These chronic stressors are absolutely traumatic. Racism. And I think this one happily has come to our attention more and more over the last few years. But the racism is a chronic stressor that people are forced to think about every day. I have a dear and good friend who happens to be Black, and she tells me I never walk outside going into the public without thinking about the fact that I am Black, because it puts me at risk many, many times. Invasive medical procedures can be chronic stressors. So can community trauma. So can historical trauma. And I hear a lot about historical trauma where I live, which is Montana, because our Native American population has been through egregious historical trauma that's passed from generation to generation. I have a good friend who told me that she was never allowed to write down Blackfeet on, forms when they were asked about their genetic background. She said, what are you? Are you English, Irish, Scotch? She said, I'm Blackfeet. They were not. Her mother, absolutely, it was a steadfast rule in their household because she honestly and truly believed, given her background, her mother's background, that it was dangerous to write that on any kind of government forms or even school forms. Or it can also be a family member with a substance use disorder or an untreated mental illness. So these are all chronic stressors. But I think the three things that we need to remember in terms of trauma are the three E's, and that's events or circumstances that cause the trauma. It's experience, or how you are perceiving the event determines whether it's traumatic or not for you, and effects. So that includes adverse physical, social, emotionally, or spiritual consequences of the circumstances. The experience of trauma is affected by how, when, where, and how often. What we know about trauma, particularly childhood, sexual, physical, or emotional abuse, or physical or emotional neglect, is that it doesn't just happen once. It happens over and over and over again over the course of a childhood. And so how it happens, when, where, and how often are all things that play into compounding the effects of that trauma. So how common is it? Research by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention shows, and I would love to hear, and I see we've got a comment, so I'm going to share that in just a moment. But I want to know if you think that this is overstated. I'm always shocked by these. 1 in 5 Americans was sexually molested as a child. Wow. 1 in 4 was beaten to the point of there was a mark. 1 in 3 couples engages in physical violence. 1 in 4 grew up with relatives with an alcohol abuse disorder. 1 in 8 witnessed their mom being beaten or hit. I find this horrifying. I think that we are seeing the effects of this every day among our clients who are served by PATH. But it's interesting to me that this data shows that there are 10 times more kids who have been endangered in their own homes than there are soldiers serving in war zones. Scary. I find that, sort of scary. I'd be interested to know your perception. Is that accurate? Sandra, I'm just going to share these while you're thinking about that and adding your comments. I will just share what has been shared to the meeting chat. Sandra DeLosa from Nashua says, providing municipal welfare to residents experiencing homelessness or at risk. That's what she does. We certainly see clients who have or are currently experiencing trauma, and I hope to learn more skills to connect and build trust. I think that's wonderful. Jenna Morris with the Homeless Outreach MHGCM says, I've learned that the lens through which we see people we work with makes all the difference. Absolutely, Jenna, I agree. Everyone deserves fierce, unbiased advocacy and care. Thank you, I agree. I couldn't agree more. Nicely said. So here are some of the traces of traumatic experiences. Some of them are very large scale. It's history and culture. It is sometimes law. It's red zoning. It's all of the things we're seeing that affect our culture at the micro level, but happened at the macro level. It can come really close to home with intergenerational trauma. It can leave traces on our minds, emotions, our capacity for joy and intimacy. And it can also leave traces on our biology and immune systems. And then it's interesting because the way trauma is embedded in the brain is different than other memories, because sounds or smells or images or a combination of those three can throw somebody right back to the original trauma in terms of the way they're experiencing what's happening right now. And so this is fascinating because a smell or a sound or an image can evoke this to the point where people feel paralyzed or terrified or enraged, just as they did during the experience when it first happened. And so long after the trauma is over, it can be reactivated at the slightest hint of danger. And the danger might not even be danger that I would perceive or you would perceive, but it is the danger that this individual perceives. And it mobilizes massive amounts of stress hormones and precipitates intense sensations or impulses or aggressive actions. I knew a woman once who had been required by the court to begin attending, it was a substance use treatment group, right? It wasn't AA or NA, it was more, it was managed by a therapist, and it was a requirement. Well, at that point, the only people in that group were males until this one woman walked in. And in that group of about 12 people, and the therapist, who was also male, there were about 3 of these guys who were wearing motorcycle jackets, and smelled like leather and smelled like cigarettes because they were all smokers. And this woman walked in and was absolutely triggered by what she saw and smelled. And she turned around and walked right back out. Well, she'd been mandated into this treatment venue by the court. And so this was putting her freedom at risk. This was putting her kids at risk and her job at risk, because if she didn't meet the criteria that had been established for her and in her justice plan, she was going to have to go to jail. She could not make herself stay in the room, but the clinician followed her out during a break and she had stayed in the building and said to her, "You didn't stay. What's up?" And she said, I cannot do this. I felt like I was suddenly trapped in a room where my rapist had been multiplied times 12 between the smell of the leather and the cigarettes and all these men in a circle. She said, "I just can't do it." They did find other options for her. But that was really a great example of how that traumatic experience can catapult you right back to when it happened. So trauma is not just an event that took place sometime in the past. It's also an imprint left by that experience on mind, body, brain. And I'm going to say Bessel van der Kolk, MD, is one of the best I've found about trauma. I will be quoting him quite a bit through this presentation, and there's a link to his book at the end. I was amazed by this book, and I would encourage you to look for it if you have an interest in trauma. It's exceptional. Some of the after effects of trauma, people absolutely suffer from memories. You might feel victims of childhood sexual abuse have told me they feel like they would like to claw their own skin off. It's an agonizing shame. It changes perceptions and imagination. Now that's interesting. It changes perceptions and imagination. It limits imagination. So imagination is critical to the quality of our lives. I mean, it gives us the opportunity to envision a hopeful future. It's a launch pad for making things come true, our ambitions, our goals, our hopes. But what trauma does, it continually pulls people back to the past and limits the opportunity to engage in imagination that can move us forward to the next step of our lives. Traumatized people also have the tendency to superimpose their trauma on what's going on around them to the, right now. So passing somebody on the street, maybe more than just passing a stranger on the street. It can be, you can be triggered to a memory of violence or rape or emotional abuse. So it may not just be a stranger on the street. It could be that you're suddenly seeing somebody who really traumatized you in the past and is evoked again. The after effects, this is fascinating, and I actually quoted it because it was so important, and there's the source, The Body Keeps the Score, fabulous book again. But Bessel van der Kolk said, we now know that more than half of people who seek psychiatric care have been assaulted, abandoned, neglected, or even raped as children, or they've witnessed violence in their families, more than half. I am not surprised by that. I'm also going to look over here. Barbara Holstein said to everyone, yes, that's accurate. Those sort of horrifying and egregious numbers. She said in her experience, it's accurate. She worked as a gal and for the PD, so absolutely yes. So thank you for that, Barbara. I appreciate that validation. Here are the factors that increase the impact. If it happened early, if the perpetrator should have been, not necessarily that they were, should have been a trusted caregiver, if there was blaming or shaming involved, or you're silenced or not believed, that really increases the impact of trauma. So a child that says, Mom, my stepdad is coming into my room at night. If she says that can't possibly be true, or hush, or, well, it's your own fault if you wouldn't act like such a little hussy around him, it's just going to absolutely increase the impact of trauma. And I think you could make the case that that in and of itself is emotional abuse. Not being able to trust somebody who you should be able to trust because they're taking advantage of you one way or another, or hurting you, or abandoning you. All of these increase the effects of the trauma. So how can the same event be traumatic for one person and not another? And I know I said early on, and maybe a couple times beyond that, it's how you perceive it. So I'm going to give you one little example of something that happened in my life that I think kind of highlights this. So in our early marriage, my husband and I lived in deeply rural, I would say frontier Montana, Mineral County on the Idaho border. And we lived in a cabin we built on 40 acres. So there was nothing really around us but trees and off in the distance, hills. And I was home alone with my two little boys, and they were about 3 and 4, I would say, little boys. Well, this storm comes up. It was this humongous windstorm. It was the most amazing thing I ever saw. But the interesting part was it was very channeled, right? So it was very channeled, and you could, when it first kicked up, and then going forward, it got louder. But when it first kicked up, it almost sounded like giants walking, because this channel of wind coming down through the trees, and it's very heavily wooded, coming down through the trees. You could actually, it was like hearing a giant walking. And in the wake of that, you could see trees coming down in a path toward us, right? One of my little boys was absolutely terrified. He thought this was going to blow the house down like the big bad wolf, and that we would all be killed. And he raced up the stairs and hid under the bed. He thought that was probably the safest place he could be. This is a child who very likely had some trauma from this event. My other little boy was scrambling for the door because he wanted to see if he could fly. The wind was that strong. So, he absolutely didn't perceive it as a life-threatening event. He saw it as a real opportunity. So I'm scrambling to make sure this little kid stays in the house. And in the meantime, my other one is upstairs shaking in fear. So there's sort of the difference in perception, and it can be very different from one person to another, even if you're witnessing the same event. Sorry about that. So trauma disconnects us. It leaves people feeling powerless. It has lasting effects on our ability to form intimate relationships, to trust. It creates distance between people and between us and the world. We're going to build a safe space, and that can often mean shutting other people out. But we know that healing is possible, and that if you can find and maintain a sense of safety, you're going to develop the ability to trust yourself and others. So what that means is reconnection. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. Motivational interviewing is absolutely one of the best strategies for doing some of that. So I want you to remember, as we go forward with this, what you want to ask is not, when you see behaviors or strategies for survival, I want you to ask, what happened to you? Not what's wrong with you. What happened to you? And realize and remember that symptoms, what you're seeing as maybe behaviors that are not conducive to moving forward in your life, could really be adaptations to traumatic events. And we know that healing happens within the context of relationships. So we know that trauma can cause long and short-term effects, affect coping responses, relationships, developmental tasks, and impact our responses. Signs of trauma responses are behavioral. And I would be really interested in seeing what you have seen in terms of behavioral responses to trauma. But it can be blowing up when you're corrected, or fighting when criticized, fighting or leaving, fight or flight, fighting or leaving when you're criticized or teased. It can be being very protective of personal space, not wanting to be touched. It can be engaging in really reckless or self-destructive behavior. And here's a couple others. What I would ask is, what are you seeing in terms of behavioral responses? There's also emotional and physical responses. So those include nightmares or sleeping problems, or fear of being separated. It's difficult to trust other people, and maybe even unexplained medical problems. We know that adverse childhood experiences are really connected very strongly, correlated strongly with adverse adult outcomes, and that includes medical problems of all sorts. So it can also be psychological. So confusion over what's safe and what's dangerous, or trouble focusing or concentrating, or even difficulty imagining the future. People who are deeply traumatized have experienced significant trauma early on and throughout their lives, may not be able to even imagine a happier future. I just finished reading the most wonderful book. It was, I'm going to tell you, it was Demon Copperhead, which was Barbara Kingsolver, who I love. But it was, he really captured what happens with trauma and substance use disorders, subsequent substance use disorders. It was really pretty much a primer in understanding the effects of trauma, starting with this child who was born to a mom who was in overdose when he was born, and then ended up eventually overdosing when he was older and dying, and going on through his own life. Fascinating, but I would highly recommend that novel because it really does give us some really personal insight into what that looks like. Here are more signs of trauma, and who can share, what are some of the other ones that you've probably noticed? Shame and sadness, being emotionally numb, physical symptoms, racing heart or headaches or stomach aches or flashbacks. These are all things that can be signs of trauma. Not remembering periods of your life. I think this one's one of the really interesting ones. I know a guy who's a dear and good friend of mine who often says, I don't remember much about my early childhood. And this was a guy whose dad was dead by the time he was 12 of alcoholism. There had been domestic violence in the home. There was a lot of poverty. There was a lot of making do. And he just says, I don't remember anything about my childhood. And that is really a very significant sign of having survived childhood trauma. The trauma impacts the brain. And I love this sort of simplified diagram of the brain. But the brain, I love this phrase, the brain is use dependent. How we use it is going to form it. Trauma activates systems that change the neuron response and cognitive pathways. So you can be pulled right back to that embedded trauma by something like the smell of a motorcycle jacket and cigarette smoke. The brain drives, of course, the body's fight, flight, or freeze stress response, and it can also really and truly affect the physical development of kids' brains. What do we know about the brain is that it sort of matures from the bottom up. So the last thing to be activated is the prefrontal cortex, which is really going to be our ability to modulate or ameliorate our behavior. So if it's happening in the early development stages, the base of the brain, sometimes people call it the reptile brain, it is really going to be primitive responses from that point. And so it might be fight or flight. And that's going to be the reaction to the fear and trauma. Some of the effects. So adrenaline is, of course, one of the hormones that helps us fight back or run. And it increases when we remember trauma or experience trauma. And normally, those kind of hormones dissipate. We get a handle on on the situation. We take a deep breath. We go back to baseline. But with the effects of trauma are constantly elevated stress hormones. And it results in some of these things: memory and attention problems, irritability, sleep disorders. It can contribute to long-term health issues. Another possible response is denial. Nothing happened. I'm going to say in my conscious mind, nothing ever happened. Nothing is happening now. Everything is fine. Everything is just fine. And we go forward with our smile as if nothing ever happened, but our bodies are still registering the threat, which is really tough. I mean, that is really tough. So the alarm signals don't stop. The emotional brain keeps working, and stress hormones keep sending signals to the muscles. And so there's this sort of double-edged sword, right? But the physical effects of long-term alarm signals don't stop are illness and use of medications. It can be drug and alcohol abuse to desensitize, can be food to desensitize. It can be any one of a number of things, and illness. So those are some of the effects. I love this. Stephanie Covington put this together. It was the progression of trauma. So you've got the event, right, which overwhelms your physical and psychological systems. And then the response is fight or flight or freeze, and sensations like numbing or hyperarousal or hypervigilance. And we, I think we can probably all speak to the hypervigilance. Systemized nervous system and changes in the brain. And then current stress, which are reminders. And then it just all results in a painful emotional state that can lead you to retreat into isolation, or dissociation or depression or anxiety. Can be self-destructive activities like substance misuse or eating disorders, or cutting, or it can be just destructive action like aggression or violence. And I'm going to look to see, because Julie added something to the chat. I'm going to thank you. I've got lots here. So the name of the novel was Demon Copperhead, Barbara Kingsolver. Fabulous. I think it's on the bestseller list right now. So some of the effects are that you're observing lack of trust, refusing services. Absolutely. Sometimes schools chalk it up to ADHD instead of going further to check for past trauma. True. Thank you, Barbara. And then Julia says, this is Clyde. I would like to add that with trauma, you will find a lot of dual diagnosis, as individuals with an existing intellectual or physical disability are more susceptible to experience trauma. That's a wonderful observation. Thank you for that, Clyde. So what happens with trauma? People absolutely get stranded. They just get stranded. And I will say the barbed wire is a really good analogy for me personally. I live in the country, so go figure. But, the barbed wire has a lot of little thorny barbs that can really hurt if you try to go under it or through it. And it keeps people from moving forward. So let's talk about some of the tools for engagement. And so we're sort of moving into the motivational interviewing section of this. I would say this is really a client-centered counseling approach that helps people begin to make positive change in their behavior by empowering them to take charge of their own recovery. This is a wonderful strategy for engagement. This is a wonderful therapeutic strategy. It can be kind of difficult to employ, but I would be interested to hear, are many of you already using motivational interviewing? Have you had training in it? It is absolutely worth your time one way or the other. I'd be interested to know what you're seeing. So one of the things that we know are the tasks of motivational interviewing. So what does that mean? It means engaging through conversation. And that really means listening and learning to listen on a deeper level. somebody once said to me, and it was just sort of in a grocery store or someplace like that, if I remember correctly. And we had been visiting just for a minute, sort of passing time. And then this this woman just said to me, "Who are you?" I mean, we'd been visiting for a couple minutes. It was a long line. And I said, "Well, I'm Sherri Downing." And she said, "No, who are you?" And I said, "Well, I work for Advocates for Human Potential and on issues of homelessness and housing." And this, I mean, this woman, and I didn't know her. That was this sort of fascinating thing, and probably why it resonated and why I kept it. But one of the interesting thing was then she looked at me really sort of deeply and she said, "No, I'm just inviting you to think about, who are you really?" And that was a really deep and interesting question. And eventually she went through the line and I went through the line, and I was left thinking about that for a while. Who are you? And that is one of the greatest gifts that you can give to somebody through the practice of motivational interviewing, is to really engage through conversation and really learn and make an attempt and make the effort to really learn about this person, and to give them a chance to learn about themselves through your interaction. This is important. One of the things I've learned over the many, many years and decades, actually, of work that I've done in this field is that we often don't take the time to look deeply or to focus on what's important to the client. And that's something that we can bring to the table and give as a gift. But what I also have observed is that many of the people that we're serving, many of the people we're working with through PATH, people who are coming out of homelessness or are still stranded in homelessness, people who have serious mental illnesses or substance use disorders or co-occurring disorders, these folks often aren't heard. No one is asking them, "Who are you?" No one is asking and no one is listening. Oftentimes, you often are really the only people who can give this gift, or who have the time and willingness to give this gift to somebody. And it's debilitating. It compounds trauma that people have already lived through when nobody will look or listen or hear. There was a woman one day on a street corner here in my town who had been there pretty much all day. And she had a sign, "Help, I need money for food for my kids." And I stopped to talk to her because, I mean, that's what we all do, right? I mean, we've spent years, probably many of us, stopping to talk to people who are experiencing homelessness. And I gave her a card that had, resources printed, and probably offered her, $5 or something, what I had in my pocket. But I said, if you go talk to our YWCA, they're doing some amazing work in our community, and they may be able to help. We've also got God's Love, and we've got, I named some of the resources around town. And at the end of our conversation, she just looked at me and she had tears in her eyes. And I was so touched, because what she said to me was, "Thank you." And I said, "Welcome." And she said, "I want you to know that you are the first person who's looked at me in the eye today or talked to me." And I think that this is the important part of motivational interviewing, is that you take the time to evoke their motivation for change, negotiate plans, and often resolving conflicting or ambivalent feelings or thoughts. So here are the motivational how-tos, sort of the Reader's Digest version. You want to resist telling, directing, or convincing. You want to understand their motivation. Who are you? What are their values, needs, abilities, barriers? You need to listen with empathy and with a different heart, with your heart, and empower. I mean, setting achievable goals, and maybe they're baby goals, maybe they're baby steps, and that's okay, because even a baby step can be the first step to overcoming a barrier. You want to understand their frame of reference, and that means using reflective listening, and that's something we all practice in Psychology 101, but it's important to use that reflective listening to make sure that you really hear what they're saying and hear it deeply from the heart. You want to express affirmation and acceptance. No, this is not a judgmental practice by any stretch. It is not helpful to be judgmental. And that is not something that you want to offer back. Well, if you just would have, or if you hadn't, or you made the mistake by picking up that first, whatever. You want to express affirmation and acceptance and elicit and reinforce statements of change. So if somebody is beginning to recognize a problem or a concern, a desire and intent or ability to change, you want to absolutely reinforce that. That is the first step. Monitor the degree of readiness and affirm freedom of choice and self-direction. In other words, the person needs to drive the bus. You can be there to help. These are the 5 principles of motivational interviewing: empathy, developing discrepancy between their goals and values and the current behavior. I know that you want to become, I know that you want to, get that really good job, and that you've done a great job putting together your resume, and I applaud that. But how is your continued use of your substance of choice going to hurt that, your ability to get toward that goal, or help it? So, if you're picking up the pipe tonight, how well are you going to function in that interview? Or how well are you going to be able to function in terms of the basic strategies for survival? You want to avoid arguing or power struggles or confrontation, and support somebody's ability to be, I'm trying to reframe, but you want to support their self-efficacy and roll with resistance. And resistance can look like arguing. So interrupting, denying, ignoring, those are all really signs of resistance. So do you have any others that you would like to share? I would be happy to hear what you observe when people are resisting. I love this. Use ORs, and that's open-ended questions, affirmation. I love that you were able to go to the Social Security office and, apply to get your Social Security card back. That is wonderful. I see that in a reflection. I saw how hard you tried to maintain, to keep your temper yesterday. Summary. Okay, so we've been through this, and this, and now you're here, and look at the difference in your life. So, open-ended questions, affirmation. The affirmation may be the only affirmation that this person has received, might be ever, honestly. We're seeing people who are coming from backgrounds of such trauma that maybe nobody ever just patted them on the back or said, good job, or what is your hope, and how are you getting there? Nobody has affirmed them. People come to us oftentimes with so little. There are a lot of things that we take for granted if we've come up out of a good, solid home. And I will say most of us are going to have some trauma in our backgrounds because we're human. There's going to be some trauma there, but trauma on trauma on trauma on trauma is hard to even understand, to the point where you internalize what you've heard. And I think that's one of the worst effects of really significant trauma, is that you begin to internalize, I'm not good enough, I don't matter, I'm, name the epithet, I'm stupid, I'm ugly, I'm fat, I'm skinny, and I'm unlovable. And that's what it comes down to. I'm unlovable. And you may be the first person in a long time, or the first person ever to really see the good and the strength in the people that you're serving. And that is one of the gifts you bring to the people who are coming to us from backgrounds of significant trauma. And I would say that's virtually everybody. And the way that you can begin to affirm is through open-ended questions, and through that reflective, deep heart listening, and by summarizing, and by just saying, sometimes I'll use a phrase, "You done fine, dearie," because my great grandmother used to say that, "You done fine, dearie." And I love that. But "you done fine, dearie" can go a long way with people who have never heard that before. And so use your oars. This is an affirmation, this picture of a cat. This will sound silly. But my grandson has taken a great interest in taking pictures. And so for Christmas last year, he gave me a stick drive of, oh my gosh, hundreds of pictures that he took. Some of them are gorgeous. We live in Montana, and his family is really good about getting out and about. And I said, "Kellen, I love your pictures." And he said, and I said, "Would it be okay with you if I begin to use some of your beautiful pictures in my presentations?" And I make presentations all the time, and PowerPoints and things. "And I would love to share some of your pictures." And he said, "Oh, Nana, do you think people would like my pictures?" And I said, "I think they would love your pictures." And then just this last week, I was talking to him, and I said, "Oh, I don't know if you remember, but I used that picture of Lucky, your cat, in one of my presentations." And he said, and I said, I had to credit it. So you know what it says underneath? And he said, "What?" And I said, "Picture by Kellen Downing, 2020, used with permission." And he was so excited. He said, "Well, why did you do that, Nana?" And I said, "Well, because the editor pointed out to me that this clearly wasn't just, wasn't just a picture that I pulled off clip art or something like that." And he said, and that it needed to be credited. I said, what she was telling me is it was good enough that it needed to have a name attached for the photographer. Oh my gosh, this little kid was through the moon. He's 14 now, and that's a hard age. But that kind of affirmation could go a long way. I think the important part of that little mini story is just saying, look at what your client is good at. What are they good at? And there's going to be a lot of things that you see. People who can survive without homes, people who can survive the level of trauma that most of them are coming to us from, are strong. They're strong, they're resilient, they're resourceful. They are often able to figure things out that most of us would have a dickens of a time figuring out, right? So recognizing that is huge. I think one of the outcomes is you can help people begin to see themselves as capable. You can begin helping people see themselves as capable. You can also begin helping people hope and visualize and imagine a better future. There was a group that I was working with that was comprised of all survivors of domestic violence. And it was a group that we held over a period of time, weekly, as I recall. And these women would come in. Well, when they first came in, and we had the room set up with chairs in a circle. And when they first came in, most of them were in really drab clothes, like old sweatpants or dark sweatshirts, no color. They came in with their heads down. They came in with their arms crossed, sort of protectively across their chests. They sat down in the chairs, but they were sort of hunched over. They weren't looking at the people next to them or across from them, and they weren't really responding. And what we really began talking about was, who are you? And so one of the first questions we asked are, what are the things that you do for self-care? What do you do? What do you do for self-care? What are some of your favorite things? And they don't have to be expensive things. They don't have to be, big or important things. They can be a bubble bath or a nice piece of chocolate, or just taking half an hour just for yourself to sit in the quiet. It can be any one of a number of things. During that first session, not one of those women could come up with something that she did for herself, or that she wanted for herself, or that she could even recognize as a treat, as something that she would do for herself. The next question we asked was, what is one thing that you like about yourself? Do you have pretty eyes? Do you have a strong, healthy body? Do you have a smart brain that helps you get through life every day? What is one thing that maybe you have gorgeous fingernails? What is one thing that you can say that you like about yourself? And again, none of them could come up with an answer to that. By the end of the time that we had together, and like I said, over several weeks, people were coming in, they were speaking to each other, they were beginning to form relationships, peer-based relationships. They were wearing bright colors, some of them. They had gone to the trouble to fix their hair. They were able to answer the questions, and they were beginning to see themselves as capable. And the most important part of this is they were beginning to see themselves as worthy of hope, worthy of a future that didn't include all the pain they've been through. This practice affirms positive statements and behaviors. It offers people options, and the options are going to be very different. The people that you're working with need to drive the bus, and their options of choice may not be your options of choice, and that's okay. Sometimes people are going to make mistakes, and that's okay. They're their mistakes. You need to be there to help them, get back up on their feet and keep moving, because this practice instills hope. And it encourages consideration of role models and past success. You can look back and see, what did I do that worked really well and that helped me move forward? And how did I succeed? And what did that look like? And then, who do I admire? Who do I want to be like? How can I begin engaging myself in sort of the role model, the person I admire? How can I take something from that person I admire and build it in so that it becomes one of my tools? I will tell you one more little short story, and then we'll move on to a couple acknowledgments. And then I would love to hear, from you. We'll have some time for that. But one of the things, I had a granny who was absolutely adorable. Beth heard this story yesterday because I was sharing it with somebody else, but she was a chameleon. She could talk to anybody. She could fit in anywhere. She was a little out there. My granny, when she came to my high school graduation, she had dyed her hair bright red and was wearing a mini skirt. This was a long time ago when mini skirts were still in style, and fishnet stockings and high heels. And she had a cigarette, that she was dramatically smoking most of the time. She was hilarious. But I loved that she could be outrageous and make people laugh. I loved that she could be the warmest and most compassionate person in the world. She could talk to anybody and she could engage with anybody and make them feel like $1,000,000, right? She was just one of a kind. And that day, the day of my infamous, graduation party, she, with her fishnet stockings and her mini skirt and her cigarette, was wearing red high heels, these cute red high heels. And many years later, when I had to clean out her house, I took those home with me, those little red high heels. And I've worn them a lot over the years. But when I go to speak, like before I came to you today, what I think to myself, and it's sort of just a little mantra, is today I'm going to wear my granny shoes. Today I want to be able to tell a story so that you hear it in your heart. And I'm going to be able to speak so that you hear and hopefully engage you with what I'm trying to share. And so that was one example that I have of, building part of granny into what I do. So when I step up to the computer or the microphone or wherever I am, I think today I'm going to wear my granny shoes. And it has been really helpful. But if you can sort of encourage people to find something they want to be, somebody they want to be like, or a piece of somebody that they want to adapt, that can be a really useful tool. So with that, I would just say, please look at SAMHSA's Trauma-Informed Approach Toolkit. It's really wonderful. There is a hot link here to the tool. A lot of the information here was sort of digested and shared. And then this is the book I've been talking about, not the novel because I just finished it last night. But this one is The Body Keeps the Score, Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma. Dr. Vanderkolk is probably one of the primary people that he is amazing about his understanding of trauma. And he's been a therapist for many years. And he uses in this book, he uses a lot of the stories of people who he has worked with and talks about different kinds of trauma. Like he's worked with people who have come back from war. He's worked with people who are coming from backgrounds of horrible and horrific trauma in childhood and many other kinds of trauma. But he draws this together really neatly. And one of the things I love about this book is it does a great job of explaining how the trauma really affects how the brain works and how the wiring changes. So I would really, if you have a deep and abiding interest in trauma, I would encourage you to look for this book. I downloaded it from Amazon onto my Kindle, and I have thoroughly appreciated it. Here are some more resources about motivational interviewing. And with that, I would love to hear from you. Beth, are people able to come off mute? And if so,
I believe so.
Great. So if you want to come off mute and say something, I would love to hear it. I'm mindful that you all are experts in this, and I would love to hear from you. If you don't want to come off mute, you're welcome to put something in the chat, but we've got about 10 minutes, 7 minutes, 8 minutes to go. Please talk to me. Did this work? Did it resonate? Did it not? where has lightning been striking for the people you're serving? What have you seen? Clyde, I really loved what you said about with trauma, we find a lot of dual diagnosis. Could you speak to that a little bit more? That was such an insightful comment that I would love to hear more if you are willing. And
Yeah, no, that's fine. It's just that's more of the background that I come from before I started doing outreach. But you would tend to find individuals that had intellectual disabilities, or other mental illnesses, but they were more susceptible to it because they could be taken advantage of in certain situations as children. So you tend to find the adults that have that, they have that trauma that goes along with it because they experienced it.
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And what we also know is that homelessness in and of itself is traumatic, right? And so people that are coming from backgrounds of significant childhood trauma are also going to be, if they're in poverty, if they're in situations of domestic violence, if they're on the streets in homelessness, that's trauma on trauma on trauma. So Barbara, did you have anything more to add? I thought that was really interesting that you talked about schools chalking it up to ADHD, and I think that's really true. But I don't, kids are not my specialty, even though I've owned a few and now have grandies. But I wonder, how would you look at getting at the trauma and past just the ADHD diagnosis? Do you have anything to add to that?
It's kind of hard. I just came across it with one of my cases, and they kept saying, this kid's always in trouble. He's just got ADHD. Just can't, he can't keep his hands off other people. He's hitting people. He's doing this. He's doing that. And they kept saying it was just ADHD. And I kept saying, no, it's not. There's got to be something more, and it needs to be investigated because this child is not getting the help he needs. Right. And so finally, after a year of fighting and for me trying to get the child the help he needed, I got the help in the form of a therapist. Mm-hmm. And the therapist came up with 5 different things as a diagnosis. Besides, occupational, he had disorders on top of disorders. And after working with the child, found out all the traumas, one trauma after another trauma after another trauma. This kid didn't have a chance. And so, yeah, and that's the hard thing. The schools, they can't do what they can't do. I mean, that's a whole, if, the parent, the judge, whoever doesn't see it, doesn't care, doesn't whatever. So it's a tricky thing, but I've worked with victims for the past 30 years. Wow. Domestic abuse victims for, I guess 30 years. And
yeah, welcome to my world. Thank you.
Yeah, and there has not been one that's just like the other one. I mean, every case, every person was different, and they were all suffering the same kind of trauma. They are not worthy. Their husbands or boyfriends or whoever took away everything from them slowly and insidiously, but took it away. And then you can't just put it back. You can't just say, oh, well, you're great. Don't worry what he said. That never happens that way. It's kind of, when you were talking about clothes, put what would be your nicest clothes. I had a case where the girl didn't have any clothes because the husband took them all and threw them in the woods. Yeah. So, I mean, it's trauma is, and I say to everybody, if you don't have the book that she was talking about, You need to buy it. The Body Keeps Score. It is the best book. I've had it for many, many years, and I would not, and I've had other people, I've told them, I said, I'll give you a gift because you have to read this book, and you'll go back to it time after time.
Over and over. Barbara, thank you. This was super helpful. We've got one more comment on here from Sandra. Sandra, you say sometimes homelessness is from a traumatic event. We've got a couple minutes left. Would you like to add to that? Sandra, I don't know if you would. I can read your comment. Sometimes homelessness is from a traumatic event, such as a domestic violence or a fire, etc. Now we have to help the person that navigate the homeless situation as well as a traumatic event. I love that. I liked your question from the beginning. What happened to you instead of what is wrong with you? Oh, don't have a mic. I'm sorry. No worries. I think that's probably one of the most important things. Listening with our hearts is one of the biggest gifts we can give. And there are a lot of people who simply don't have that gift. It isn't in them. But I think if you're attracted to this work, that's my bias. That's why I love working with Path and all of you, is that you have the heart to see this and you have the heart to hear these stories. And that really, that is the biggest gift that you can give somebody, is to say, who are you? No, who are you really? And how can I help? So I think we're pretty much out of time at this point. I have appreciated having this time with you today. And we've got now, I believe, an hour off for lunch. So thank you. And I appreciate, Barbara, thank you for coming online. Thank you, Clyde, for coming online on audio. And thank you all for your comments. It was fabulous. And we'll see you after lunch.